Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for organising this excellent event, and thank you for giving up your Friday nights in this hot room. As Tatiana said, I've been asked to lay out something about the environmental crisis that we're facing and give an assessment of the political implications in the context of the current world order that we have. I think the sheer magnitude of the crisis is something that I think a lot of people in this room will be familiar with. Certainly the people on the platform will be very familiar with. But I think it bears repeating because of its scale. And I think if there's one thing that I would like to take away from what I say today, though, it's that this is a dual crisis. It's a crisis of the environment, but also a crisis of social justice. And I think we stand to succeed or fail on the basis of tackling both of them together. And I think in order to do that, we need a different politics. Greenpeace, you may know, works with political organisations and social groups across the political spectrum, and will work with people wherever we agree with them. But I do think that Frontdoor has a particularly important role to play at the moment. We're now 13 months away from the next UN Global Environmental Summit to tackle climate change. And I think that this is going to be an historically significant climate summit held in Paris. And with the time that we have left to really turn the corner on climate change, that's 5 to 10 years, I think this is going to be a make or break summit. And so the political environment, the political space that Frontdoor can help to create for Hollande, and the pressure that you can put on Hollande in this context is going to be really important, not just for France, but globally. So I think today we're not just having an intellectual discussion. I think we're sort of hoping to work towards political positions on the environment that could win us the prize of pulling humanity back from the brink. We're not going to do it just in this room today, but I think it's an important discussion that we're starting to have here. So I was going to say a few words about Greenpeace, but I think most of you are probably familiar with Greenpeace as an international global organisation that uses non-violent direct action to draw dramatic attention to the problems that we face, and also takes direct action to intervene and disrupt the abusers of our planet. But what I will touch on just at the end is the role I think that bearing witness and civil disobedience has to play in part of the progressive response to this crisis. So on the environmental crisis, I think the science is becoming increasingly clear and increasingly worrying. In a sense, we've got a train hurtling down the track at us, and we need to take very fast action to avoid what is a real catastrophe. And I'll say again, I think we've got 5 to 10 years to really turn this around. The political consensus is that we need to stay below 2 degrees global average warming, 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels in order to prevent a chain reaction of catastrophic climate effects. Others, such as Ecuador and other already affected countries, would say that actually 1.5 degrees is probably more than we can bear, because already they're seeing the effects. And they're already seeing floods and storms and droughts. In particular, Ecuador is seeing its glaciers shrinking and the water supply is becoming more difficult to find. When people might be familiar with Lord Stern's work, Lord Stern wrote the seminal economic analysis on climate change in 2006, and at that point there was a 75% chance of averting a 2 to 3 degree rise in temperatures. And I think now the World Energy Agency and the World Bank and others and scientists would agree that we're heading for more like a 4 to 6 degree rise in temperatures with the high carbon infrastructure that's already in place and that's planned. So I think it's still definitely possible to avert the worst elements of that. It's still possible to keep below 2 degrees. And I think what's crucial is that every measure that we take to reduce the rise in global temperatures will protect people across the world, and particularly protect the poorest, the most vulnerable across the world. So every effort that we make to reduce the impact is worth it. I think those who hold their hands up in dismay and say it's too late or it's too difficult, I think we owe it to the most vulnerable across the world and ourselves to make every effort. So to put it another way, if the world is to limit global warming to 2 degrees, it must keep greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to under 450 parts per million. And that's in the context that just this spring we hit 400 parts per million for the first time in 3 million years. So the concentrations are rising, and they're rising fast. But we do still have a chance to keep below 2 degrees, and that's going to need us to keep 4/5 of the world's energy fossil fuels in the ground. Most of the coal needs to stay in the ground, and that would be a huge turnaround for our economies, which are very fossil fuel based. So quickly touching on the impacts, get this doom and gloom out of the way. Already, you will be very aware that we've seen increased frequency of floods and droughts, and the sea levels are rising, and we're seeing fiercer storms like the Hurricane Sandy that we saw last year in the States. I think was starting to sound a warning bell across the US at least on the fact that climate change is going to affect us all, and the richest countries as well as the poorest. I'm working on the Arctic campaign for Greenpeace at the moment, and the Arctic ice cap that acts as a global refrigerator for the whole planet is melting pretty fast. It's melted something like 75% in the last 20 years, and within this decade, perhaps this year, we will see a completely ice-free polar cap at the North Pole. I think what I want to say though is that this isn't just an environmental problem, and I'm sure people know much more about the consequences too. This is a social crisis, and we're currently also seeing 1 billion people living in absolute poverty across the world. We're seeing almost half of the world, over 3 billion people living on less than $2.50 a day, and over 100 million people don't have access, even basic access to electricity. So this is very much a social justice crisis. The poorest 40% of the world's population accounts for just 5% of global income, and the richest 20% accounts for 3/4 of the world's income. And why I say this is because unless our actions and our politics on climate change is consistent with rapid development of those parts of the world, we won't get a global agreement, the agreement that we need in 2015 in Paris. And I think the challenge for the 21st century, the challenge for the next 5 to 10 years, is really to increase the living standards of the people the most needed, whilst concentrating resource consumption within ecological limits. So, what's needed? We need a vast turnaround in the investment patterns in the economic system that we have at the moment. Going back to Lord Stern, he calculated that about 2% of our GDP needs to be spent on the solutions to climate change to turn around the supertanker and prevent a 2-degree temperature rise. And ironically, that's almost exactly the same amount of money that's currently pumped as subsidies into the fossil fuel industry. So you can see where the conflict of interest lies there. The dynamics of investment are shifting in the right direction. It's just moving too slowly at the moment. So on the one hand, we do have global investment in renewables, particularly wind and solar, racing ahead, which is great news. And so for the past 3 years, it's exceeded investment in fossil fuels and nuclear power, which gladly is on the decline. Last year, fully 70% of all European power investment was in renewables, which is a phenomenal figure. But at the same time, emissions are continuing to rise because at the same time we've got more investment and more production coming from coal than before. And coal is the dirtiest fossil fuel, so we're seeing in some countries a shift from gas to coal and worsening the emissions. Coal burning now represents almost 1/3 of power generation, and it's rising across Europe. It's a mixed situation. We are moving slowly in the right direction, but I think it's clear that probably not moving fast enough. I think some of the investments that we've seen, particularly in China, the vast investments that we've seen, China tops the rankings in terms of investments in renewable energy, contrary to the kind of negative stories that you will always hear about China and climate change. They've been pumping huge amounts of money into renewable energy and driving down the prices of renewable energy as the technology improves. And we're now reaching a point where renewable energy, particularly onshore wind, is competitive with coal and gas in some places, and that's going to become incredibly disruptive to that economic power base that the fossil fuel industry has. But it's clear that by itself, this system of neoliberal free market economics is completely incapable of dealing with this crisis by itself. It's the system that's driven us into this mess, and it's not in its DNA to try even to do anything about it. It's driven by profits, and it's not driven by human need, and it doesn't have any reference to the environmental, the ecological boundaries that it operates in. And in that sense, unless we have the politics that's capable of speeding a change to a different system, of disrupting some of the power bases that have been driving the problem, then we're going to see this system continuing to fail the people and the planet. And I don't think that we have. I don't think we have time to shift to an entirely socialist or different system away from capitalism within the 5 to 10 years that we've got to turn the supertanker around. But I do think that politics, progressive politics, can play a crucial role in intervening into some of the debates and the struggles that are going on between the fossil fuel industry and some of the solutions. And it is clear that we can manage a lot of the risks. There's a lot of good news to be had. It is possible. We do have most of the technology already to shift to an almost 100% renewable-based economy globally. Greenpeace has done a huge amount of research to show that, and we've got models of each region of the world showing exactly how you would make that transition. The technology largely exists, and within that space of time we can see clean technology developing even more. So I think developing a politics that can bring unity behind some of the solutions will help us intervene into the debates that are happening right now and put the framework for social justice on the table when the negotiations are coming to the fore in Paris in 2015. But also it can be an incredibly positive driver towards the kind of progress and prosperity and internationalism that I think we would all like to see in a different world, and a world that can provide alternatives, as Tatiana said, to the appalling consequences of austerity that we're seeing in lots of places. I think investment in renewables is investment in something that can have benefits in every part of the world and is of genuine social and economic value. But how do we get that huge scale of investment necessary, particularly now in the context of the economic crisis and the drive to austerity? And how do we get that progress in the context of the fossil fuel industry, particularly the oil and gas industry, being some of the most established and consolidated, powerful parts of our current economic setup? How do we make that progress when some of the most reactionary forces connected to the fossil fuel industry and politically connected are using austerity and the financial crisis as a cover to suggest that the environmental movement only wants to set people's living standards backwards and wants to make people go back and live in caves and use candles. And how do we make progress in the context where the countries that are probably doing most to grapple with these problems and working out the really genuinely difficult question of how do you raise people's living standards and do it within the ecological constraints when those countries are coming under most fire from the powerful Western countries. So I think really I think what we need, and I think what's useful in this discussion is forming a political narrative that attracts mass support and quickly and is capable of talking about an inspiring future, a positive future, a future that people would like to live in, and talk about increasing people's living standards. And I think we need an approach that can both look to the future and the different world that we want to build, but also politics that's capable of making these very sharp interventions into the current debates. I think I saw that we've got a meeting coming up soon on Ecuador, which I think is great. I think Ecuador is one of those countries which is taking a different economic and social path that is genuinely grappling with the difficult question of how you raise a population out of really pretty extreme poverty. But at the same time, it's taking a globally responsible approach. It's calling for its own oil reserves to stay in the ground and for a global solution to protecting its rainforests and keeping the oil in the ground. It's intervening into the climate negotiations and calling out those who would accept basically unacceptable solutions at Copenhagen. A very controversial view that it put forward, but certainly challenged the status quo of the richer nations. And Ecuador is a country that's calling on civil society around the world to stand with the poorer countries and to work together ahead of 2015 and to work from now at an early stage to try and find that unity in a progressive way that respects and recognises the needs of the poorer countries, so that we have a genuinely mass and powerful social movement that's capable of changing the politics of those leaders in Paris in 2015. I think in Europe we have a responsibility as one of the richest parts of the world to both offer the clean investment in clean technologies and some of the solutions as an alternative to the austerity packages that are being pushed forward and that are punishing most of the southern countries of Europe. I mean, it's ironic that places like Spain and Portugal and Greece have been putting huge amounts of investment into clean energy, into wind and solar power, and those industries have been genuinely robust, but the weight of the economic crisis has undermined the whole package that they put together. And I think we need a politics of hope, of unity and action, and we need a politics that isn't business as usual. I think making unusual alliances, making alliances between political and non-political bodies, between social groups, between others in struggle is important. And coming from Greenpeace, I think that sometimes we need to take a radical approach. I think we need to stand up and be counted and call out those who are causing the crisis. And I think sometimes that does mean taking direct action. I think tactics are important. I think we need to build the broadest movement so that everybody feels that they can come on board. But I also think that civil disobedience has its role.